Okay, boys and girls. So I want you to think about this before we start chapter 2. How has life improved for Mia and her family since her parents became owners of the Calivista? What have you noticed so far that they have been able to do that they weren't able to do when they were under the ownership or the thumb of Mr. Yao? So think of some of those things, maybe make a list. We'll talk about some of those things. So we're going to move on to chapter 2, and you can see in the right-hand corner that there are some vocabulary words I want you to listen to as we go through this chapter. They are the words agonizing, hesitantly, beckoning, haste, and adorned. Okay. And I want you to think about this question. Explain how being on television impacted the Calivista. Okay. So a little preview to what we're going to be reading about today. Okay. Think about how being on television impacted the Calivista. So here we go. Chapter 2. We all gathered around the small TV in the manager's quarters. Hank turned the volume all the way up while Lupe, the Weekleys, my parents, and I sat cross-legged on the floor. Everyone leaned toward the screen. There, on the evening news, was a man standing directly across the street from the Calivista, holding up a small dog. The dog had been found right here on Coast Boulevard, hiding under a parked car. As the owner tearfully explained how thrilled he was to have his dog back after 3 months of agonizing over where he was, we all stared at the giant Calivista Motel sign just to the left of his head. "This is free advertising!" Fred shouted. We all jumped up and shook hands, congratulating one another on our amazing luck. My mom poured everyone cups of jasmine tea as my dad hopped on the phone and started calling his immigrant friends and the paper investors to tell them the good news. Billy Bob pointed at the TV. "How much do you think a spot like that would have cost?" Fred whistled. "I don't know, thousands of dollars, I'd say." His belly shook as he laughed. Mrs. T flipped to Channel 4, and everyone gasped. We were on Channel 4, too. Lupe and I jumped up and down and started doing our happy dance. Hank held up his index finger. "I have an idea," he exclaimed. He looked to my parents. "Where's the ladder? I need to add some words to our sign." My parents took Hank to the back alley behind the pool, where they kept the ladder that Jose used to fix the cable up on the roof. Fred and Billy Bob helped Hank move it to the front of the towering Calivista sign. As Hank grabbed the letters to the new words he wanted to put up, we all looked up at the sign. "You're not thinking of climbing all the way up there, are you?" Mrs. T asked Hank. The sign was easily 20 feet tall. "It's much too high." "Don't do it, Hank," I seconded. What if he fell? We still didn't have health insurance. We'd try to buy some as a small business, but the only plan that was affordable had a minimum requirement of 6 full-time employees. The insurance company said investors didn't count. But Hank was already halfway up the ladder, the letters gripped in one hand. As he added the new words to the sign, we all held our breath. It wasn't until he was safely back down that we read the message. There, under the words Calivista Motel, $20 a night and 5 miles from Disneyland, were 4 words that made my heart swell with pride. As seen on TV. Leave it to Hank to think up the perfect way to take advantage of our 15 minutes of fame. I rubbed my eyes the next morning, awoken by the sound of honking horns on the boulevard. Peeking out the window, I could see customers already lined up at the front office, ready to check in. "Mom! Dad! Wake up!" I yelled, jumping out of bed. My parents and I changed out of our pajamas and quickly got to work, checking people in and handling requests for wake-up calls and late checkouts. The new sign was bringing people in faster than you could say, Calivista. Hank stopped to say good morning as he was getting ready for his day, and when he saw how busy we were, he immediately stepped behind the front desk. Hank was a natural checker-inner. He loved talking to the customers, and they loved talking to him. Everyone wanted to know how we were on TV, and as soon as he told them the story of Cody, the puppy being found just across the street, the customers all awed. I glanced down hesitantly at my book bag lying beside the front desk, not quite ready to leave. It was all packed up for my first day of sixth grade. Go, Mia, my dad said. We've got it covered. But we'll be fine here. You're going to be late for school, Hank said, looking at the clock. It was nearly 8 o'clock. My fingers lingered on the row of keys hanging next to the stack of registration forms. We were running low on the forms. Expertly, Hank tore open a box of fresh new ones and set them on the table. I picked up my backpack. Okay, I said. My mom handed me a custard bun for breakfast. I stopped by the kitchen, and when she wasn't looking, swapped it for a granola bar. At the door, I stopped and turned back. Wait, what about your job at the mall? I asked Hank. Don't worry about it. He waved me off. I'll just take one of my vacation days. I still have a bunch. I ate my granola bar as I walked the familiar 2 blocks down Meadow Lane to my school. It was a great value bar, not like the Quaker Chewy ones the other kids ate at school. My dad said it didn't matter. They were all the same inside. He didn't eat any granola bars himself, preferring the bin rice crackers from the Chinese grocery store. But I liked the granola bars better. As I tossed back the rest of my breakfast, a white Mercedes came roaring behind me, screeching to a stop. I turned around to see Jason and his mom pulling up to me, and I quickly scrunched up the wrapper and stuck it in my pocket. Mrs. Yao waved from behind the wheel, her enormous diamond ring catching in the light. Get in, Jason said, jumping out of the car. We'll give you a ride. He looked different, taller and with stiffer hair. Had he gelled it? His eyes smiled back at me while he waited. I hesitated for a second. What would Lupe say if she saw me arriving at school in Jason's car? But it was 102 degrees outside, and I could feel the car's air conditioning beckoning me from the sidewalk. I climbed inside and sat into the soft leather seats. How was your summer? Jason asked me as his mother drove. I had been practicing what to say when I saw him again. A casual but impressive story, complete with sales figures. We managed to double our occupancy rates. The number of repeat customers went up by 50%, and we helped 25 immigrants, providing them free rooms and meals to help them get on their feet. But in my excitement and haste, all that came out was, good. I quickly added, how about you? Did you go anywhere? I waited for the itinerary of no fewer than 3 continents, but Jason shook his head and said, nah. I lifted my eyes from the automatic window controls, surprised. You didn't go anywhere? Yeah, I just stayed home, he said. His mom called from the front. We traveled way too much last summer, didn't we, sweetie? Jason gazed out the window and didn't say anything. As we pulled up at school, I spotted Lupe in her mom's car and waved to Mrs. Garcia. Mrs. Garcia had on a bright red headband and smiled at me as she waved back. A few times this summer, she'd come along with her husband to the motel. She always brought over great big bowls of freshly made guacamole and chips, and we'd all dive in. A few times, she'd even pitched in and helped my parents clean the rooms when it was a full house. Lupe's eyes darted back from me to Mrs. Yao to Jason, and she raised her drawing pad to her face like a shield. I thanked Mrs. Yao for the ride and got out of the car, running over to Lupe to tell her all about the new customers this morning. That's amazing, she squeaked, peeking over at Mrs. Yao. The sign must have worked. What sign? Jason asked, walking over to us. Quickly, I told Jason about being on TV. Really? What channel? I can't believe I missed it. Then with a groan he added, all I did was watch TV this summer. Lupe's face turned red. The bell rang, and she grabbed my hand and pulled me away from Jason toward the classrooms. The walls of Dale Elementary School were adorned with hand-drawn blue and gold welcome back posters. Unlike last year, the walls were not freshly painted, but they still looked warm and inviting. As we walked down the halls, the younger kids scattered out of our way, gazing at us in awe. I smiled, remembering what it was like to be a 4th grader, looking up at a 6th grader. They seemed as powerful as the sun, like if you stared at one too long, you might go blind. I couldn't believe I was now a son. Lupe and I walked arm in arm to the front office, where we learned that we were still in the same class again, Mrs. Walsh's class. Jason was so bummed he wasn't in Mrs. Walsh's class, too. He threw his backpack down on the floor in a fit of frustration, and as if that wasn't enough, he stomped on it. Lupe started tugging my arm away from Jason and out of the office, but I resisted her pull. I wasn't ready to go to class just yet. Hey, it's going to be okay, I said gently to Jason. Jason turned to the receptionist. Can I switch classes, please? I want to be in Mrs. Welsh's class too. The receptionist shook her head. Sorry, I'm afraid not. All the classroom assignments are final. Jason stuck out his lower lip. Lupe tugged on my arm again, holding the door open with her foot. He'll be fine, she insisted. I glanced at Jason, who looked far from fine. He was staring at the receptionist the way some of our customers did whenever we told them we were all out of double beds. Slowly, I walked over and put my hand on his back. Hey, we'll still see each other at recess, I offered. Jason hung his head, nodding slightly. And that is the end of chapter 2. So I want you to think about those vocabulary words, what you heard, and then I also want you to think about how life has improved since they were on TV. What did you notice there? Okay, awesome. That was a fun chapter.